I sat in my own living room, still wearing black from my husband's funeral, when my son looked me in the eye and told me I had nothing. Not the house I paid for, not the company I built, not even a place in the life I created. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It hardened. Because betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the one person you raised, trusted, and loved the most. And what he didn't know was, I had already seen everything coming. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and then maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Hayes, and I am 67 years old. I have lived in Charleston, South Carolina for most of my life, in a house that faces the Atlantic Ocean and carries more memories than I can count. To the outside world, I have always been known as the widow of William Hayes, a respected businessman who built one of the most successful restaurant groups in the southern United States. People still stop me at local events to tell me how remarkable my husband was, how visionary, how brilliant. I always thank them politely, because that is the version of the story they were given. The truth is more complicated and far quieter. I was the one who started Southern Hearth Dining Group. I used a small inheritance from my mother to open a modest restaurant with only 2 tables and a borrowed stove. In those early days, I worked from sunrise until well past midnight, cooking, cleaning, managing accounts, and learning every detail of the business the hard way. When William and I married, we made a decision that would shape the rest of our lives. In the 1970s, a woman leading a business was rarely taken seriously, especially in the South. So William became the face of the company, while I remained behind the scenes, building everything that made it work. I never resented that choice. I believed in what we were creating together, and I did not need recognition to feel fulfilled. Over the years, that small restaurant grew into a network of establishments known for quality and consistency. I handled operations, finances, staffing, and expansion strategies, while William handled public relations and partnerships. It was a balance that worked for more than 40 years. When William fell ill with heart disease, everything slowed down. For a year, I divided my time between the hospital and the company, making decisions during the day and sitting beside him at night. Watching him fade was the hardest thing I have ever endured. When he passed away, the silence that followed felt unbearable. The house we had shared for 3 decades became too large, too quiet, filled with echoes of a life that no longer existed. My son, Daniel, is 40 years old now. He has worked within the company for several years, mostly managing one of the restaurants. He knows the routines, the staff, and the daily operations, but he has never truly understood the deeper structure of what we built. Daniel has always wanted to prove himself, to step out of his father's shadow, but he often mistook authority for capability. I saw his frustration growing over time, though I hoped experience would eventually guide him toward maturity. Then Vanessa came into his life. They met at a corporate networking event and married less than a year later. Vanessa was polished, confident, and quick to adapt to our world. She spoke with ease, asked precise questions, and carried herself as if she already belonged. Yet there was something in the way she observed things that unsettled me. Her attention lingered not on people, but on assets, decisions, and influence. I noticed it during her first visit to our home, the way her eyes moved across every detail, measuring rather than appreciating. I chose not to confront her. Instead, I watched, listened, and waited. After William's death, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. Conversations became shorter, tones colder, and there was an unspoken tension that settled into every room. I could not yet name what was changing, but I felt it clearly. Something beneath the surface was moving, slowly and deliberately, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it revealed itself. If you are still watching and already sensing that something is not right beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you are with me. Now let us move into what changed everything. The week after William's funeral passed in a haze I could barely describe. People came and went, bringing flowers, food, and condolences that all sounded the same after a while. I nodded, thanked them, and carried myself with the quiet dignity Charleston expects from a widow. Inside, though, I felt hollow, like I was moving through a life that no longer belonged to me. 7 days after we buried my husband, Daniel and Vanessa asked if we could sit down and talk. There was something in the way Daniel said it that made me pause. It was not a request. It was closer to a decision already made. We met in the living room, the same space where William and I had spent years planning our future. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I remember noticing how still everything felt, as if the house itself was waiting. Daniel did not hesitate. He stood across from me, shoulders squared, voice firm in a way I had never heard before. He told me that his father had left him everything. The house, the company, the accounts, everything. Then he added the words that stayed with me long after. I would receive nothing. Vanessa stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on his arm. She said very little, but her presence was deliberate. There was a faint smile on her face, the kind that tried to appear sympathetic, but never quite reached the eyes. I did not interrupt. I did not raise my voice. I simply listened. Daniel went on to explain that it would be best if I moved out of the house. He suggested a smaller property owned by the company, something more manageable for someone my age. He spoke as though he was offering a solution, something reasonable, something kind. I studied him carefully. His words were controlled, almost rehearsed. This was not a spontaneous conversation. Every sentence had been thought through. Vanessa added a few comments about practicality, about simplifying life, about making things easier for everyone. Her tone was soft, but there was an edge beneath it that I could not ignore. For a moment, I allowed myself to look at my son not as the man standing in front of me, but as the child I had raised. I searched for something familiar, something that connected the two. What I saw instead was distance, a quiet certainty that unsettled me more than anger ever could. I asked one question. I kept my voice calm and steady. I asked when William had signed this will. Daniel hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. Then he answered, saying it had been handled privately, shortly before his father passed. Vanessa quickly supported him, reinforcing the idea that everything had been properly arranged. That small pause echoed in my mind long after the conversation ended. It did not match the man I knew. William had always been precise with legal matters. He would never leave something so important vague or undocumented. When they left, the house felt even quieter than before. I sat alone in my study, listening to the distant sound of the ocean. The rhythm of the waves was steady, unchanged, as if nothing in the world had shifted. But everything had. I picked up my phone and called Jonathan Reed. He had been our attorney for years, a man who understood not only our business, but the way William thought. I explained what had happened, repeating Daniel's words as clearly as I could. Jonathan listened without interruption. That, more than anything, told me something was wrong. When I finished, there was a pause. Then he spoke with a certainty that cut through everything I had just heard. William had never signed a will. There were discussions, drafts, conversations about the future, but nothing official. No document had been finalized, no legal record existed. I sat there, holding the phone, feeling the weight of that truth settle in. The conversation in the living room replayed in my mind, each detail sharper now. This was not confusion. This was not grief speaking. This was something deliberate, and whatever it was, it had already begun to unfold. If that moment made you feel the tension building and you are starting to question what is really going on, comment number 2 below to stay with the story. Now, let us uncover what was hidden. The morning after my conversation with Jonathan, I woke before sunrise, something I had not done in months. Grief still lingered, heavy and familiar, but it no longer blurred my thoughts. Instead, there was a sharpness I recognized from years of running a business. When something does not add up, you do not react. You observe, you gather, you wait. I moved through the house quietly, making coffee in the same kitchen where I had built a life with William. Every corner held a memory, but that morning, I did not allow myself to linger in them. There would be time for that later. For now, I needed clarity. Daniel's words from the previous week echoed in my mind, not for their cruelty, but for their precision. He had not sounded uncertain. He had sounded convinced. That distinction mattered more than anything else. I decided not to confront him. Not yet. Instead, I returned to the company as if nothing had changed. I reviewed reports, checked in with staff, and maintained the rhythm people expected from me. To anyone watching, I was simply continuing my responsibilities. In reality, I was paying attention to details I had once trusted others to handle. Jonathan introduced me to a financial investigator named Thomas Keller, a man with a reputation for noticing what others overlooked. He began by examining recent transactions connected to both Daniel and the company. Within a few days, he identified irregular patterns. Funds had been transferred between accounts in ways that did not match our normal operations. The amounts were carefully chosen, small enough to avoid immediate attention, but frequent enough to suggest intention. I sat with those reports in my office, tracing the movement of money from one account to another. Each transaction alone could have been dismissed. Together, they formed something deliberate. Someone had been moving resources quietly, creating distance between the source and the destination. We expanded the investigation to include legal documents Daniel had signed over the past year. That was when the picture became clearer. Several forms granted authority over financial decisions, giving control to someone other than him. The language was complex, filled with clauses that required careful reading to fully understand. I knew Daniel well enough to recognize that he would not have questioned them. He trusted too easily when he believed something benefited him. I studied his signature on each page, familiar and steady, yet placed beneath terms that shifted power away from him. It was not forgery. It was something more subtle. He had signed willingly, but without understanding the consequences. That realization led me directly to Vanessa. From the moment she entered our lives, she had shown an unusual interest in structure, ownership, and expansion. At the time, I had dismissed it as ambition. Now, it felt calculated. She had positioned herself as the one who handled details Daniel overlooked, gradually becoming indispensable in decisions he did not fully grasp. Thomas uncovered another connection that confirmed my suspicion. Vanessa had been communicating with an attorney known for questionable practices. His name appeared in cases involving document manipulation and financial misrepresentation. It was not proof on its own, but it aligned too closely with what we were seeing to ignore. That evening, I returned home and sat in my study, surrounded by documents that told a story I could no longer deny. Daniel was involved, but he was not in control. He had been guided, step by step, into a position he believed he had earned. The realization did not bring relief. It brought a deeper kind of pain. It meant my son had trusted the wrong person, and in doing so, had turned against me without fully understanding what he was doing. I knew then that acting too soon would cost me everything. Vanessa had built this carefully, layer by layer. If I wanted to dismantle it, I needed more than suspicion. I needed evidence that could not be dismissed. So I chose patience. I would watch. I would listen. And I would wait for the moment when the truth could no longer be denied. If you can feel the truth getting closer and the situation becoming more dangerous than it first seemed, comment number 3 below, so I know you are still here. Now let us see how the plan begins to unfold. In the days that followed, I made a conscious decision to change how I appeared to them. It was not easy, because every instinct in me resisted the idea of stepping back from something I had built with my own hands. But I understood something they did not. Strength revealed too early can be challenged. Silence, when used carefully, becomes an advantage. So I allowed myself to become smaller in their presence. I stopped asking direct questions. I let conversations pass without correction. I nodded when Daniel spoke, even when I knew he misunderstood what he was saying. The shift was subtle, but it was enough. He began to relax, as though my quiet acceptance confirmed that he was finally stepping into control. Vanessa responded differently. Her confidence grew quickly, almost visibly. She moved through the house with a new sense of ownership, as if the walls already belonged to her. She spoke about plans openly now, no longer careful about what she revealed. Renovations, staffing changes, even ideas about expanding the business in directions that ignored everything we had built over decades. I listened to all of it. Every detail mattered. The assumptions they made, the language they used, the certainty in their tone. It told me not only what they believed, but how far they were willing to go. At the company, I maintained my usual routine, but with a different focus. I watched how Daniel handled decisions when he believed no one was guiding him. He moved quickly, often without fully understanding the consequences. Some of his choices created small disruptions, the kind that experienced leadership would have anticipated. I did not step in. Each mistake became part of a larger pattern, one that would eventually speak for itself. Meanwhile, Jonathan and Thomas continued gathering evidence. The financial irregularities were now supported by the documented timelines and account records. Communication logs connected Vanessa to individuals she had no legitimate reason to contact. Legal documents showed a gradual transfer of authority, structured in a way that concealed its true impact. Every piece fit into something larger, not random actions, but a coordinated effort. One afternoon, Vanessa approached me with an idea presented as a formality. She explained that they planned to hold an official reading of the will. She described it as a way to bring clarity, to ensure transparency for everyone involved. But her tone carried something else beneath it, something closer to anticipation. I agreed without hesitation. The decision surprised her, even if she tried not to show it. For a brief moment, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. Then it disappeared, replaced by the same controlled confidence she always carried. After she left, I sat alone and considered what this meant. This was not about legality. It was about perception. They intended to present their version of the truth in front of witnesses, to make it real simply by declaring it. Employees, partners, extended family members. If they succeeded, it would shape how everything was seen moving forward. That understanding confirmed what I had already begun preparing for. The reading of the will would not be the end of their plan. It would be the moment where everything came together. In the weeks leading up to that day, I continued my role without deviation. I attended meetings, reviewed reports, and allowed Daniel to take the lead in situations he was not ready for. He grew more confident with each passing day, unaware that confidence without understanding can become a liability. Vanessa inserted herself deeper into the company structure. She spoke with senior staff, reviewed operations, and positioned herself as an essential part of the future. Some employees accepted it cautiously. Others waited, watching, sensing that something was not right, but unable to define it. At night, I returned to my study and reviewed everything we had gathered: documents, timelines, financial records. I organized them carefully, ensuring that when the moment came, nothing could be dismissed or ignored. I did not feel anger. I felt something steadier than that, a quiet certainty built on preparation and truth. They believed they were in control of what was coming. They had no idea they were walking directly into the moment that would unravel everything. If you are starting to realize this was never just about a will, and something much bigger is about to happen, comment number 4 below to continue. Now we are stepping into the moment where everything explodes. The morning of the will reading arrived with a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Charleston usually woke gently, with the rhythm of the tide and the distant hum of life returning to the streets. That day, everything felt suspended, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I woke before dawn, not out of restlessness, but from a quiet awareness that something long set in motion was about to reach its turning point. I dressed with care, choosing a simple gray suit that reflected restraint rather than authority. I wanted to appear exactly as they expected, a grieving widow, subdued and compliant. It was important that they saw nothing beyond that. Confidence, when hidden, becomes far more effective. The reading was scheduled at our flagship restaurant, the first location that had ever carried the name Southern Hearth. That room had witnessed decades of growth, decisions, and celebrations. Now, it had been arranged for something else entirely. The private dining space was immaculate, polished surfaces reflecting soft light, chairs positioned with precision, every detail designed to convey order and legitimacy. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, standing at the center of the room with a presence that seemed unfamiliar to me. He spoke with several executives, his tone steady, his posture firm. Vanessa remained close beside him, her composure deliberate, her attention moving across the room as if she were already assessing the outcome. I took a seat toward the back, allowing myself to become part of the background. From there, I could observe without interruption. That position gave me what I needed: perspective. As the room filled, conversation softened into silence. Daniel stepped forward, holding a folder that carried the weight of everything he believed to be true. When he began to speak, his voice carried clearly, measured and controlled. He spoke about his father, about responsibility, about continuing what had been built. The words were chosen carefully, shaped to create an image of continuity and authority. Then he began reading the document. I watched closely as each declaration was made: ownership of the company, the house, the financial assets, all transferred entirely to him. My name appeared briefly, reduced to a conditional mention that placed me outside the structure I had created over a lifetime. The room responded in subtle ways. Some faces remained still, others showed hesitation. A few accepted what they heard without question. When Daniel finished, there was a pause that seemed to stretch longer than expected. It was not applause that followed, but something quieter. Vanessa brought her hands together first, a controlled gesture that broke the silence just enough to signal approval. That was when I stood. The movement was small, but it carried. Chairs shifted slightly, attention redirected, and for the first time I felt the room turn toward me fully. I walked forward without haste, each step steady, measured. intentional. There was no need for urgency. Everything that needed to happen was already in place. I did not look at Daniel immediately. Instead, I turned toward Jonathan. He was already prepared, rising from his seat with the same calm precision I had relied on for years. The briefcase in his hand contained more than documents. It held the difference between perception and truth. As I reached the front of the room, I felt the atmosphere change. It was subtle, but undeniable. The certainty that had filled the space moments before began to shift. Confidence gave way to something less stable, something uncertain. I finally looked at my son. For the first time that morning, I saw something in his expression that had not been there before. It was not doubt yet, but it was no longer complete assurance. I spoke without raising my voice, without confrontation, without emotion. The words were simple, but their meaning was not. In that moment, everything they believed to be settled began to come undone, not through force, but through truth that could no longer be ignored. The moment the truth was placed in front of everyone, the room did not erupt the way people might expect. There was no shouting, no chaos, no dramatic collapse. Instead, there was silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that settled over every person present, as if the air itself had thickened. It was the kind of silence that forces people to confront what they have just witnessed. Jonathan stood beside me, methodical and composed, laying out each piece of evidence with a precision that left no space for interpretation. The will Daniel had read was not valid. The signature did not belong to William. The notary attached to the document had no legal standing. Each fact was supported by documentation, each claim reinforced with records that could not be denied. I kept my attention on Daniel. At first, he held himself upright, as though refusing to absorb what was being said. His expression remained fixed, but there was a tension beneath it that I recognized. It was the beginning of a realization, the moment when belief starts to crack under the weight of truth. Vanessa moved before he did. She stepped forward, attempting to regain control of the narrative. Her composure tightened, her voice steady but strained. She tried to reframe everything as confusion, as an attempt to undermine what had already been established. But the more she spoke, the more her control slipped. It was subtle, but it was there, in the slight shift of her tone, in the way her gaze moved too quickly from one document to another. Jonathan continued without hesitation. He introduced the financial records next, tracing the movement of funds through a series of accounts that led back to Vanessa. The pattern was clear, structured, deliberate. It was not an error. It was a system. I watched Daniel as the details unfolded. His focus shifted from Jonathan to Vanessa, searching for something to hold on to, an explanation, a denial, anything that could restore what he had believed. What he found instead was distance. The final revelation came with a quiet finality. Vanessa had been working with an external investor, someone positioned to benefit from the collapse of everything we had built. The plan had been simple in concept: gain control, transfer ownership, sell the company, and disappear with the proceeds. What remained would have been empty, a shell of something that once mattered. That was when Daniel changed. It was not sudden, not dramatic, but undeniable. The certainty that had defined him earlier was gone. In its place was something raw, something uncertain, something closer to truth. He turned toward Vanessa, and for the first time there was no confidence in his expression, only disbelief. She did not meet his eyes. That absence of response carried more weight than anything she could have said. In that moment, everything became clear to him in a way it had not before. He had not been leading anything. He had been following, guided by trust that had been carefully manipulated. I felt the weight of the decision before I spoke. It was not about proving anything anymore. That had already been done. It was about what came next. I could have allowed everything to collapse. The evidence was strong enough. The consequences would have been immediate and irreversible. Both of them would have faced the full impact of what had been set in motion. But Daniel was still my son. I addressed him not with anger, but with clarity. His actions had consequences, whether he intended them or not. Trust did not excuse responsibility. He had chosen to believe what was convenient, and that choice had nearly cost everything. Then I made the decision that would define what followed. Vanessa would face the legal consequences of her actions. There would be no protection, no intervention. The process would continue as it should. Daniel, however, would be given a path forward, not a return to what he had, not forgiveness without effort, but an opportunity to rebuild through accountability. The room remained silent as that reality settled. For the first time, the future was no longer something they controlled. It was something I had chosen. If that twist shocked you and you did not see it coming, comment number 6 below to stay with me. Now, let us move into Chapter 7 and see what happens after the truth is revealed. What followed did not unfold in a single moment. It came in layers, quiet at first, then increasingly impossible to ignore. The silence that settled over the room after everything was revealed did not break into chaos. Instead, it carried forward into the hours that followed, shaping every reaction, every movement, every decision that came next. Vanessa was the first to lose control of herself. The composure she had maintained so carefully throughout the reading collapsed in small, visible fractures. Her posture shifted, her breathing changed, and the certainty that had defined her presence disappeared. She tried to speak, to redirect, to regain influence, but the structure she relied on no longer existed. The evidence had removed any ground she could stand on. Jonathan acted quickly, but without urgency. That was always his way. Every document was secured, every record prepared, every necessary step taken with precision. By the end of the day, the situation had moved beyond the room and into a formal process that would determine its legal outcome. There was no need for confrontation. The system would handle what remained. Vanessa was taken into custody later that afternoon. There was no spectacle, no raised voices, no dramatic scene. Only the quiet finality of consequence arriving exactly where it had been heading all along. The investor connected to her actions was identified soon after, and the investigation expanded to include every transaction we had uncovered. What had been designed as a controlled plan had become a chain of actions too clear to deny. The company did not collapse under the weight of what had happened. Instead, it shifted. Employees who had sensed something was wrong began to understand the truth. Conversations that once carried uncertainty became grounded in clarity. There was relief, but also caution. Trust, once shaken, does not return immediately. It requires time, consistency, and proof. Daniel disappeared from the office for several days. When he returned, he was not the same man who had stood at the center of that room. The confidence he once carried had been replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, but real. He moved differently, spoke less, and listened more. It was not transformation yet, but it was the beginning of it. I observed him without interference. This was not something I could guide directly. It was something he had to face on his own. His actions had consequences, and those consequences were now part of who he was becoming. The house felt different without Vanessa. The tension she carried with her had left, but what remained was not immediate peace. It was space. Space to think, to remember, to understand what had nearly been lost. I walked through each room with a new awareness, recognizing not only the memories they held, but the effort it had taken to protect them. There were moments when the weight of everything returned sharply. The memory of Daniel standing across from me, believing I deserved nothing, did not disappear with the truth. It remained quiet and persistent, something that would take time to fully confront. Yet, alongside that pain, there was something steadier: resolution. The uncertainty that had surrounded me for months was gone. What remained was clear, defined, and grounded in truth. Daniel eventually came to me, not with excuses, but with acknowledgement. It was incomplete, fragile, and still forming, but it was honest. And in that honesty, I saw the first real possibility that something broken might, with time, be rebuilt. The days that followed were not marked by celebration or relief. They were defined by work, quiet, deliberate work that required more patience than strength. I understood that surviving what had happened was only the beginning. What mattered now was whether everything that had been shaken could be rebuilt into something stable again. I returned to the company with a different focus. For years, I had trusted the structure we created to carry itself. Now, I needed to see it clearly again, without assumption. I spent my time observing rather than directing. I listened to conversations, watched interactions, and studied how decisions moved through each level of the organization. Patterns began to emerge. Some people had remained steady throughout the uncertainty, continuing their work without shifting their loyalty. Others had positioned themselves differently, aligning with what they believed would become the new leadership. It was not betrayal in the obvious sense, but it revealed where integrity had weakened. That distinction mattered. I made changes carefully. There were no public announcements, no dramatic removals. Instead, I adjusted roles, reassigned responsibilities, and when necessary, ended professional relationships that no longer supported the stability of the company. Leadership is not only about growth, it is also about protection, and sometimes that requires difficult decisions made without recognition. At the same time, I worked to restore clarity within the organization. Uncertainty thrives in silence, so I chose transparency. I met with department heads, explained what had happened in terms that focused on facts rather than emotion, and outlined the direction we would move toward. People did not need reassurance. They needed understanding. Daniel's role changed as part of that process. I removed the authority he had assumed and replaced it with responsibility he would have to earn. He began again at a lower level, working through the operational structure rather than above it. It was not a punishment. It was a correction that aligned his position with his actual experience. He accepted it without resistance. That was the first sign that something within him had shifted. He arrived early, stayed late, and approached his work with a focus I had not seen before. He asked questions, listened to answers, and paid attention to details he once ignored. It was not immediate transformation, but it was movement in the right direction. I observed him without interference. Growth requires consistency, and consistency cannot be forced. It must come from within. Each day he continued in that pattern. The distance between who he had been and who he was becoming grew slightly smaller. At home, the silence felt different. Without Vanessa, the tension had lifted, but what remained was not peace. It was space. Space to reflect, to understand, to accept what had happened without trying to rush beyond it. I moved through the house slowly, allowing that process to take its natural course. There were moments when I questioned my decision to give Daniel another chance. It would have been easier to separate completely, to define the situation in absolute terms. But I knew that accountability and opportunity are not opposites. They exist together, shaping what comes after failure. The company began to stabilize. Communication improved, decisions became more consistent, and the uncertainty that once lingered started to fade. It was not perfect, but it was real. For the first time since everything had begun, I felt a quiet sense of direction return. Not certainty, not resolution, but a steady path forward. What had been broken was not beyond repair. It simply required time, discipline, and the willingness to rebuild without illusion. If you are still here and feeling how everything is slowly rebuilding, comment number 8 below to continue. Now let us move toward the final outcome of this story. Time did not erase what had happened, but it changed the way it settled within me. The sharpness of those moments softened into something steadier, something I could carry without feeling consumed by it. Life did not return to what it had been. It moved forward into something different, something shaped by what we had all endured. Vanessa's case moved through the legal system with a quiet inevitability. The evidence that had been uncovered left little room for interpretation. Financial records, documented transfers, and verified communications formed a structure that could not be dismissed. I chose not to attend most of the proceedings. My presence would not have changed the outcome, and I had responsibilities that required my attention elsewhere. When the verdict came, it arrived without surprise. She was found guilty on multiple counts related to fraud and financial misconduct. The sentence reflected the seriousness of what she had done. The investor connected to her plan faced consequences as well. His involvement traced through the same chain of evidence that had exposed everything else. What had once been carefully hidden was now fully visible, and there was no path left to avoid accountability. The company continued to stabilize. Processes became clearer, communication more direct, and the uncertainty that had once lingered began to fade. Employees adjusted, not because they were told to, but because they understood what had nearly been lost. Stability returned not as a sudden shift, but as a gradual rebuilding of trust. Daniel changed in ways that could not be ignored. He remained in the position I had placed him in, working without authority, learning each aspect of the company from the ground up. His approach was different now. He listened carefully, asked questions when he did not understand something, and paid attention to details he had once overlooked. It was not perfection, but it was effort, consistent and visible. I watched him without interference. Change requires time, and time reveals whether it is real. Each day he continued in that pattern. The distance between his past actions and his present choices became more defined. He was no longer trying to prove himself through control. He was learning to understand responsibility. At home, the atmosphere settled into something quieter. The house no longer felt uncertain. It felt steady, grounded in what had been preserved rather than what had been threatened. I moved through it with a different awareness, recognizing not only the memories it held, but the strength it represented to mindset. My role began to shift as well. For the first time, I allowed myself to be visible in ways I had avoided for decades. I spoke openly about the company, about its beginnings, about the work that had built it, not for recognition, but for truth. The response was measured but meaningful. People listened differently when the full story was known. Daniel and I began to rebuild something that had been damaged. It did not happen through long conversations or emotional declarations. It happened in small, consistent moments. A shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement, a willingness to move forward without ignoring the past. Trust was not restored all at once. It was rebuilt, one action at a time. I did not forget what had happened. I chose not to. Memory, when carried properly, becomes guidance rather than weight. In the end, what remained was not a clear victory, but something more lasting. I had protected what mattered, and I had created the possibility for something new to grow in its place. In the months that followed, I began to understand something I had never fully allowed myself to consider. Surviving a crisis is not the same as understanding it. You can protect what you have built, defend it against loss, and still be left with questions about what truly matters once everything settles. For most of my life, I never needed to ask those questions. My work defined me. Building Southern Hearth Dining Group, sustaining it, and watching it grow had been enough. I accepted the role behind the scenes because it made sense at the time. It allowed the company to thrive. I believed that was all that mattered. But now I see things differently. Silence may protect something for a while, but it can also make it vulnerable. When the truth is not visible, it becomes easier for others to reshape it. I did not regret the path I chose, but I understood its limitations. From that point forward, I would no longer allow what I built to exist without acknowledgement of its origin. Daniel's transformation continued quietly. He did not try to reclaim what he had lost. Instead, he focused on understanding what he had never fully learned. He worked without expectation, listened without defensiveness, and accepted responsibility without resistance. That consistency told me more than any apology could. Change, when real, is not announced. It is demonstrated. Our relationship did not return to what it once was. It became something more honest. There was distance, but also clarity. We no longer relied on assumptions. What we built moving forward was grounded in truth, not expectation. The company moved ahead with renewed stability. The uncertainty that once threatened it had passed, leaving behind a stronger structure. Employees understood what had nearly been lost, and that awareness shaped how they approached their work. It was no longer just a business. It was something they knew needed to be protected. As for me, I found a different balance. I remained involved, but I no longer carried everything alone. I allowed my role to be visible, not for recognition, but for clarity. There is strength in being seen for what you truly are. What I learned is simple. Trust must be given with awareness. Responsibility must be earned. And what you build over a lifetime deserves to be protected, even from those closest to you. I was not defined by what nearly happened. I was defined by what I chose to protect and what I chose to rebuild. In the end, what truly matters is not what we are given, nor what is taken from us, but what we choose to protect when everything is tested. Life has a way of revealing truth in the most unexpected moments, stripping away illusion and leaving behind only what is real. Strength is not found in control, but in clarity. Not in holding on to the past, but in learning how to carry it without letting it define the future. There will always be moments when trust is broken and certainty fades, but those moments also offer something rare. The chance to rebuild with deeper understanding, to choose integrity over convenience, and to move forward with my purpose rather than fear. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If it resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to follow and subscribe for more meaningful stories like this.